Bonnie Glaser, welcome to Taiwan Talks.
Thank you so much for having me.
The stormy seas that Xi Jinping mentioned in his 20th National Congress political report, have they arrived in the thousands of protesters on the streets of Shanghai?
Well, I think when Xi Jinping was talking about the stormy seas in his political report to the 20th Party Congress, he was primarily evaluating the international situation that Xi Jinping in China finds itself with so many countries concerned about China's policies. I don't think he was really talking about the domestic situation, where there has been largely stability, although under the surface there has been growing concern, particularly about the zero COVID policies. And I think that these protests were in part sparked by the fact that the party signaled a willingness with its 20 measures to begin to loosen the zero COVID policies. And then in the end, they really did not do so. The question is whether they will really spread to encompass other issues. And there are already videos out that we have seen of people saying, "Down with Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party." So this is something I think that the party will crack down on.
You mentioned the stability that was expected in China versus the instability overseas. But then we have just talked about a possible crackdown, which would create instability. Some analysts are saying that these are the strongest shows of public defiance in Xi Jinping's political career. So what makes these protests, have you seen them so far, different to previous labor student protests? Why are they so significant?
Well, the fact that they're taking place in so many cities, so many universities around China, they're not necessarily connected to each other, but they are spontaneously developing in different parts of the country. And we are seeing some of them led by labor, by workers, for example, at Foxconn factories, and then, of course, seeing students who are leading them. It does seem to me that most of the protesters are young people, but it's hard to know. But the fact that there's very different parts of society that are protesting in so many different places at one time is highly unusual. What we've seen in China in the past is protests that are really restricted to one place, one issue, and not involving larger numbers of people. So this bears watching. And I think that the Chinese Communist Party itself is likely quite concerned about what the best way is to handle this to ensure the most favorable outcome.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that there could be a crackdown. Do you believe that it could be violent if the protest doesn't die away as quickly as it rose?
Well, I think that the party in China will first allow the people to vent their anger, and then after the passage of a certain number of days, will demand that people return to their homes. And if there are numbers of people who continue protesting, I would not be surprised if they begin to arrest people, if they begin to use limited violence. It could look something like the early days of the crackdown in Hong Kong. But I think that the party is not willing yet to use violence. And of course, this wouldn't look anything like Tiananmen Square in 1989.
And do you think that the US may use any diplomacy at this stage if it starts, the protests start getting out of hand, if there is violence used?
Well, so far, the United States has said very little. And I think that that is the right position for the US. This is, in my view, largely because, not surprisingly, the Chinese Communist Party is already blaming the United States for being behind the protesters.
Similar to Hong Kong.
Yes, the BBC reporter who was arrested, it has already been intimated that somehow he was connected to the CIA. Of course, this is nonsense. The United States has nothing to do with these protests. So if the United States government speaks out too much, this will be used as evidence by the Chinese Communist Party that the United States is involved. So I think the Biden administration must be careful.
So far, the PRC has dismissed any idea any notion of backing down, of easing the COVID measures at this stage. Do you think that they would actually resort to force over the choice of easing restrictions if the movement doesn't die down?
Beijing can do a combination of both. They can ease some restrictions, perhaps not putting so much fencing, around apartment buildings. And I've already heard that there are some signs of that in Beijing. But ultimately, they face a serious dilemma, because without a very efficacious vaccine and the ability to get it into the arms of the elderly in China, if they lift all of the zero COVID measures, there will be millions of deaths and many, many millions of cases. The healthcare system in China really cannot manage that kind of a health crisis. So the challenge that they face is whether they can develop their own vaccine that is more effective, or whether they decide to import a foreign vaccine, and one of the mRNA vaccines, which we know are more effective. And yet that might be seen as an admission that the Chinese medical system is somehow inferior to the West. I believe it would be in their interest to import foreign vaccines to more aggressively try to vaccinate their citizens, and particularly the elderly.